By August 1926, elderly lady rooming house owners in California, particularly in the Bay Area, were in a state of fear. Few were prepared to accept any new male lodgers, and some gave up letting rooms in any circumstances. A mysterious Bible-toting stranger dubbed by the press as the Dark Strangler was roaming the state. A near-silent, relatively young man, declaring himself a Bible student who needed a quiet place to read, was taking whatever room was on offer and, within hours of moving in, had departed again, leaving the raped and throttled body of the landlady behind him. It was nearly a year later that Earle Nelson was arrested and charged with 22 brutal murders. The early days of Earle Nelson epitomize the unhappy background from which so many serial killers emerge. He was born in Philadelphia on May 12, 1897. Before he was 18 months old, both his parents had died from syphilis. He was fostered by his aunt Lillian Fabian and taken to California, where he grew up. Mrs. Fabian was a fanatically religious woman and insisted on frequent Bible readings with the young boy, planning that he would one day become a minister. Earle was later described as a quiet and morbid child, and throughout his life he was a regular reader and quoter of the Bible. At the age of 10, while he was playing in the street, he was struck by a passing trolley and dragged 50 yards. He remained unconscious for 6 days with a hole in his temple and suffered forever after with crippling headaches and dizziness. As an adult, he felt such pain that at times he was unable to walk. The moody behavior he had exhibited as a child grew worse, with wild mood swings in his teenage years. Physically, however, Nelson grew into a stocky, powerful man, proud of his strength. He liked to demonstrate by walking on his hands or picking up heavy objects with his teeth, but his appearance was odd. His swarthy complexion, receding forehead, protruding lips, and huge hands led to the eventual nickname of the Guerrilla Murderer. Nelson attempted to enlist in the U.S. Navy, but was turned down as an unstable personality bordering on insanity, an event that increased his moodiness. A short time later, on May 21, 1918, he attempted to rape his neighbor's daughter, but her father was alerted by her screams. Taken to court, he scandalized everybody by his outbursts of violent profanity interspersed with long, brooding silences, and was committed to a mental institution. 3 times, however, he contrived to escape, and on the 3rd occasion successfully evaded recapture, and was pronounced discharged in his absence. Early in 1919 in San Francisco, giving his name as Earle Fuller, Nelson married a woman 36 years his senior, but the marriage lasted no more than 6 months. While his wife was in hospital, he attempted to rape her there and was once more committed. Yet in November 1923, he escaped again. Nothing is known of Nelson's movements over the next 2 years, during which time he adopted the name Roger Wilson. However, on February 20th, 1926, Clara Newman, a spinster, aged 60, opened the door of her San Francisco rooming house to a quietly spoken young man, with no luggage other than a Bible clutched to his chest. He was seen by Clara's nephew, Richard Newman, who was off to Sacramento for a few days to visit relatives. When he returned, he found his aunt's body in an upstairs lavatory. She had been strangled either before or during rape, but the vague description Richard was able to give of the likely perpetrator was insufficient for the detectives who sought the suspect. The hunt was now on in earnest. Landladies all over San Francisco and the surrounding districts were put on their guard. It was probably for this reason that the strangler traveled north to Portland, Oregon. There, in the 3 days from the 21st of October, he killed 3 times. Beatrice Withers was the first victim. Her body was found crammed into a locked trunk in the attic of the house she had advertised for sale. Money, clothing, including a coat and jewelry, were missing. The local police at first declared the death suicide, but they were unable to explain how the woman could have locked herself into the trunk. The next victim was Virginia Grant, who had announced that her house was for rent. Her body was discovered stuffed behind the furnace in the basement. The killer had again taken a coat and jewelry. The next day he called on Mabel Fluke. Her corpse was later found in the attic of her home. She had been brutally beaten and strangled with her own scarf. Because of the similarity of the cases in the 2 cities, the Portland police requested the assistance of detectives from San Francisco. But while they headed north, the killer was back in the Bay City, where he strangled the wife of William Edmonds on November 18th. Investigators were puzzled by the mobility of the strangler and wondered whether he might be a traveling salesman or even a railroad employee. As if to support this theory, he turned up next in Seattle, where Florence Monks had also advertised her house for sale. This time, however, he was nearly caught in the act when a realtor arrived with a potential buyer to find Mrs. Monk's body, still warm, rolled in a carpet in her kitchen. The house had been ransacked, and again jewelry had been taken. A few days later, in nearby Oregon City, rooming house owner Blanche Myers met a similar fate, strangled with her apron and hidden under the bed of the room she had advertised for rent. At last the police were able to get a line on the probable killer. Details of the stolen jewelry were circulated up and down the West Coast, and 3 elderly ladies who ran a guest house in Portland reported that they had bought some from a lodger the day after Florence Monks was found dead. They described his unusual appearance: dark, untidy hair, staring blue eyes, a jutting jaw, and long, powerful arms. An intense search for the strangler was mounted at once. While police dragnets trawled the West Coast, the killer, however, was traveling east, no doubt hitchhiking or riding the rails, stopping briefly in Council Bluffs, Iowa, on December 23rd, where he killed another landlady, Elizabeth Berard. He reached Kansas City in time for Christmas. Young Bonnie Pace was newly married, and she and her husband had decided to take in a lodger to improve their finances. They picked the wrong one. Mr. Pace returned home from work the day after Christmas to find Bonnie strangled and rolled in a rug. 2 days later, the killer struck again. It was another young woman, Germania Harpin, in her rooming house, leaving the body under her bed. Even more horrifyingly, he also throttled her 8-month-old daughter in her cot. Rumors that the child had been raped brought the horror of the citizens to an even higher pitch. The strangler was now traveling widely, and Philadelphia was the next city he visited. Perhaps the 3 killings in quick succession in Kansas City had temporarily sated his lust, for it was not until April 27, 1927, that Mary McConnell was discovered strangled in her guest house. A month passed before Jenny Randolph was murdered in Buffalo, New York, but 2 days later, landlady Fannie Mae and her sister, Maureen Oswald, were both killed and raped in Detroit, 250 miles away. and only 2 days passed before Cecilia Setsima, another younger woman, was strangled in her rooming house in Chicago. By now, the manhunt involved police forces across the United States, but their quarry swiftly crossed the border into Canada. On the 8th of June, a youngish, heavily built man in workman's clothes and carrying nothing but a Bible presented himself at the door of Mrs. Catherine Hill's lodging house in Winnipeg, Manitoba. He said his name was Woodcots and that he was a good Catholic with high ideals who needed a room. Any room would do to study. The next morning he left early on his way to work, Mrs. Hill assumed. Later that day, another of Mrs. Hill's lodgers, Mrs. Cowan, reported that her 13-year-old daughter, Lola, was missing. However, the police were diverted from their street inquiries when a distraught William Patterson came to tell them of the discovery of the body of his wife, Emily. He had returned from work to an apparently empty home, and by late evening was frantically worried. Searching desperately through the rooms, he noticed what appeared to be a bundle of clothing stuffed under the bed. It was his wife. She wore only a blouse and a petticoat and had been beaten, strangled, and raped. The police began to wonder whether the dark strangler had come to Winnipeg. A shirt and suit were missing, and they issued a description of the clothing. A second-hand dealer recalled buying them from a man on June 10th and was able to provide a fairly detailed description. An artist's impression was quickly drawn and circulated throughout the province. It was not until June 12th that the police were able to again take up the search for Lola Cowan. When they went to Mrs. Hill's lodging house, she mentioned how Mr. Woodcots had not returned, and they asked her to open his room. Under the bed lay the putrefying body of Lola, typically strangled and raped. The killer's trail was picked up in Regina, more than 200 miles to the west. On June 13th, a man sold a gold wedding band, claiming that he had just got divorced. It was Mrs. Patterson's. Then, on June 15th, a storekeeper in a small rural town, some 80 miles from Winnipeg, recognized the strangler from a wanted poster in the local post office. The police caught up with him as he walked along the road out of town. He said his name was Virgil Wilson from British Columbia, working for a local farmer. When he was told that he was being held as a murderer of many women, he laughed and replied, "I only do my lady killing on Saturday nights." Held in jail in the nearby town of Killarney, he soon escaped by picking the lock of his cell with a nail, and a 500-strong posse was quickly deputized to search for him. Fortunately, he was recaptured the next morning and transferred to Winnipeg, where, giving his true name of Earle Leonard Nelson, he stood trial on November 1st, 1927. He pleaded insanity, but only 2 witnesses, his aunt and his ex-wife, were called in his defense. He was declared sane, sentenced to death after only 4 days' trial, and hanged on January 13th, 1928.